Welcome. My name is Lynette, and this is All Things Development. Today, we're going to be looking at SAPs. This is a term that you find being used commonly in development corridors, economic corridors. So it's just good to know what it's all about. It's actually an acronym. It stands for Structural Adjustment Programs. And these were economic reforms that were put in place by the World Bank and IMF to make sure that the countries that they loaned money to were able to pay them back by following these economic reforms. And what led to these countries in the south actually borrowing this money. So we'll go back to the 70s, the early 70s. Now in 1973 there was a sharp increase in oil prices. The OPEC countries, that's the organization for petroleum exporting countries, were really happy. They had an oil boom and there was a lot of money in circulation. If anything, if you hear someone talking about petrodollars, that is exactly what they meant. There was a oil boom at that time. Prices went high up, and that also meant that commodity prices also went up. So it really injured the countries that were non-oil producing, because probably maybe if there's no oil in my country, I'm just relying on maybe agriculture, tourism, other industries. But for the oil producing um, countries, they really made a lot of money. So because there was a lot of money in circulation at that bank, the commercial banks realized that this money, we can't even absorb all of it, as in we can't loan it out everything to our own people. They don't even need it. So they thought, we can, because the developing countries were struggling economically. Many of the economies were struggling at that time. They're like, we have the surplus cash, we can lend it out at at a good rate. So that's exactly what they did. So this money was loaned out to these countries, and I remember that, even like, I know that people countries were being lent out whether they could show that they could use the money well enough. So what happened, with persistent drought and other things factoring in during that time, and commodity prices going high, exports, the amount of money they were getting from exports in the non-producing countries was just not enough to pay off these commercial loans. So the IMF, World Bank, stepped in and they said, okay, we'll bail you out. That's what sometimes people say is called a bailout. We'll bail you out, but on condition, we'll give you loans, but these loans will be conditional. So you must implement these economic reforms that we call structural adjustment programs. And most of the countries, especially in Africa, so I'll now look at African countries, most of the countries were run by the states. So there were, like banks were nationalized, other companies, like everything was state run. And it was actually, in many of the economies, they were not doing badly. So what are the conditions? What happens? What changes when you apply the SAPs? We have to first understand that the SAPs came from an ideology of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism was, let the market, let there be free markets, and the market will regulate itself. Yeah. So with very little state interference. And that was what it was based on. So the measures that the governments were to take were, first of all, privatizing most of the companies, banks, and such like things, and probably they're selling them to foreign investors. And then there was also reduction of tariffs, because tariffs are able to protect the domestic industries. But now, because we are doing free markets and there is also trade liberalization, that was one of the features of the SAPs, we are going to allow, as in, we are going to actually allow trade to imports to come in, exports to go out. There was the promotion of exports at that time. There was reduction of state spending, especially like on social spending. So things like healthcare and education that may have been free, then the people would have to pay them. They were basically like austerity measures to make sure that this loan money was paid back. But they did not really work for countries. In fact, if anything, SAPs are considered a failure in Africa and many other countries in the world. But let me just zero in on African countries. They were considered a massive failure. And later on, the IMF, World Bank had to change their those economic reforms because you now your yes, you have the aim of making sure that your loan is paid back, but at what expense, at what economic expense. And one of the things that also made SAPs, like one of the things that SAPs were supposed to do was reduce inflation, promote exports, meet the debt payment schedule, and also decrease budget deficits in those countries. So all those were factors that were affecting at that time. So the countries actually borrowed the money, and then now the IMF comes and says, "This is how you have to run your economy." And in Africa, it really hit. It's hit especially the agricultural sector because now you had most African countries were exporting primary commodities. So these commodities were not actually being, they were just going as primary commodities. They were not, there was no value addition on these commodities. So the world, and then now because there's trade liberalization, these commodities like coffee, cotton, cocoa, they go into the world market and they have to compete. It's supposed to be a fair platform, fair trade for all, right? But it was not fair trade for all because now, one of the things was the reduction of tariffs. That means also um that subsidies were not there. So, like the government, like government would protect their economies by providing subsidies. Let's say for in the case of agriculture, you find that fertilizers are subsidized, you find that maybe even water is subsidized, but all those were not there. So all that cost would go to the farmers, and the farmers would have to price their, let's say, produce at a price that they are able to cover the expenses. When they sell their coffee in the world markets, it does poorly to other areas that maybe their coffee was subsidized. I'll give you an example. And it's good, like if you want to learn a lot on globalization, trade liberalization, Joseph Stiglitz, he was the chief executive in the World Bank at some point, but he's an economist, and he really explains, he goes into depth um with this thing so that you understand how it injured a lot of African countries. You know, once the SAPs were actually given, the 80s were called the lost decade because, you know, one of the other things about SAPs, there's massive expenditure cuts. Yeah, there's also massive job losses because once you privatize, then and private entity will not keep all those employees, so they'll just be like, yeah, guys, you need to go home. So it was really tough on the common, the common just trader. For now, let's say if you're doing something like agriculture, for the people who are working with governments like banks and such like institutions, there was massive retrenchments. It was hard on the economy. It's punched hard on these economies, and up to date, some countries have never recovered under the SAPs. So yes, that's exactly what happened. And like something, let me give that example of agriculture. Like most countries would protect their nascent industries. So in economy, it's good to, it's good, yes, it's good to do free trade. You're able to, trade is supposed to flow in a global, platform. That's globalization, trade liberalization. That works because it keeps, it's good competition. The consumer gets the best commodities and things like that. On the other hand, that works with developed industries, with developed economies. When an economy is nascent, when the industries are nascent, they are really young, you cannot implement this. You have to protect them, because what happens if you're having imports that are actually cheaper than the the commodities you're producing, then it will be obvious that the business will just fall. Let me give a good example. A good example is that Stiglitz talked about in one of his speeches he made on trade liberalization. He talked about cotton in the US, cotton in the world market. So this is how, like, developed countries um killed economies. Like in the developing countries, it wasn't intentional. It's just that each country is going to protect their interests. You can't expect another country to protect your interests first before they've protected their interests. And also, that is the onus on your government. There's so much you can blame on other people, even us, especially countries in the south, developing countries in Africa. We need to task our leaders and tell them, some of these things that some of these policies that are being implemented are really hurting the people. But I think now, in the 80s, there was not much option of loans. Right now, in the 2000s, China became a superpower. So they've been able to give loans without conditions. So that is a good thing. And so they're not touching on the economic reforms, they're not touching on ideologies. They're just like, we're giving you the money and then you pay us back. How you pay us back, it's not their problem. They're not, it's hands off. You need the money, we provide the money, you know. So anyway, so in the 80s, they didn't really have much of a choice. So cotton in the US. Cotton in the US is a very, it's an export commodity. But you'll find that the government will give the farmers subsidies, like, because cotton will grow in like semi-arid areas in the US. So they'll have to, irrigation has to take place for the cotton to be okay. And you find that water is subsidized, and other things. It can be fertilizer, other things. So by the time the farmers are able to harvest this cotton, they are able to price them at also subsidized prices, at very competitive, let me say not subsidized, let's say competitive prices in the world market, so that now they can sell, as opposed to Africa, who now are following these SAPs because of the loans they had taken. So it meant that they could not give the farmers subsidies. So you find the farmers are actually taking the brunt of how expensive it is to produce this cotton. So by the time their cotton goes to the market, you find that it's way much higher in terms of price, and demand and supply. It's a competitive market. You're competing in the world market. So the American cotton gets bought and African cotton is left there. So the farmers plunge into further poverty, because actually that happened in many African countries. Like in Kenya, we export tea and coffee. There's a time in the 90s, farmers were forced to cut their coffee trees because they could not get the right, they were not able to be as competitive in the world market. There was the Robusta coffee, of course, which is cheaper than the Arabica, which is grown here. But then there's also the fact that maybe other countries enjoy some sort of protectionist laws, and they're able to price their coffee at much less than what were able to price our coffee. So this is what happened, and it really hurt the economies of Africa. But for the other countries, it looks like it didn't hurt them, because they had not taken these loans with these conditions. So yeah, that basically, if anyone asks you what the structural adjustment programs are, they went on from the 80s to the 90s until now that the IMF decided that this was a fail and they needed to change. But either way, the IMF has to give money with conditions. Yeah. So, and the conditions are usually economic or even other things, but mostly economic. So, is it giving your economy a chance to, to be relevant in the market, or is it further plunging your people into further poverty? Because like now, like, and then there was also a rule, the richer countries had rules to protect their markets. They would say something like, um you can trade any good that you're not producing. So like they would not accept imports of cotton, not coffee, sorry, cotton into their countries, because they're like, hey, we produce cotton, we're not going to take any other people's cotton. But that is still not fair. That's not a free and fair market. And that's what neoliberalism is supposed to be about. We're supposed to be having free and fair markets, but it's never been free and fair. And if some of these things could be dealt with, like the amount of aid this um, OECD countries give to the developing countries would not be needed if the trade, if we were not following this SAP. So another example that I can give is SAPs in Malawi. And in the 80s, Malawi had a drought. It was quite bad. And because before that, the government was doing well, but not that well, and they still needed loan money. So they borrowed from the IMF, and they were forced to carry up the SAPs, which made the economy tank quite some. And then now they had a drought. So the government tried to help the farmers. They started giving them subsidies for fertilizers. First of all, because actually one thing that I forgot to mention, SAPs have promotion of exports. So you have Malawi is selling like their corn. They're selling this corn, and yet they need to keep reserves for these coming droughts, or coming droughts. But they're not keeping the reserves because they're trying to, the point of having exports is to reduce the trade deficit, in the budget. So and to earn money for the country, so they are exporting all their corn, and yet drought is on the way. So you'll find these other countries will buy the corn and hold on to it and then sell it back at very high prices, either through aid or loans or such kinds of things. So the government tried to protect the agricultural economy by giving them subsidies. Of course, this was one of the conditions that SCPs did not agree with. So once they gave them the subsidies, IMF said, you cannot give them subsidies, you need to stop, and they refused. So IMF just cut off the funding, in the middle of a drought. So this famine was so severe because of that. It was like a precipitation of what happened. It was like uh, what is it called? Um, it's like the way you put a stone in water and you have this ripple effect, of implementing the SAPs. Then you realize you need to, export all your corn, and then probably you don't get the right prices for the corn, and then um, by the time the drought comes, you have to buy the corn at even more expensive prices. So you'll have to ask for a loan. Then you try to protect your farmers by giving them subsidies. Then the IMF catches you and says, no, 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 you can't give them subsidies. And you're like, I will give them subsidies. And they're like, we are not giving you any more aid, we're not giving you any more loans in the middle of a drought. So it became a famine. you know so SAPs were a failure in Africa and many other countries. Yeah. And yeah, if you have any other comments about SAPs, let me know. And any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.